We kicked and screamed when it was taken away, and then we shouted very loudly for years for Nike to bring it back. And well, they listened, and they have. The synthetic Mercurial has returned, but it has to take over from this flyknit Mercurial, which might just be the best Mercurial ever made. Some very big shoes to fill, pun intended. Or in my case, some pretty small shoes to fill. We have had an incredible start to 2021 for boot releases. Today is no different. Today we are doing a full Vapor 14, Superfly 8. They're the same boot. One has a collar, one doesn't. Let's get that out of the way. Full review of those boots on the channel right now. So let's get into it. Remember to like the video, get subscribed to the channel. If you do want to support us, head over to patreon.com/bootwizard. And if you do want to pick a pair of these up, then click the link in the top comment or in my description. Let's do this. We'll start with the upper, and Nike have done one of my absolute favorite things as a reviewer with the upper of these boots. What they've done is they have made a deconstructed style design, which means that every single element of these boots, all the important tech details, is literally exposed and written on the boots. My life just got significantly easier. So let's do it. 7 numbers on the upper, which correspond to 7 pieces of tech, which are listed on the insole. Nike are literally doing my job for me at this point, and that is what makes up the brand new Vapor Posit upper. No, it's not Teijin synthetic. I'm sorry about that, but we're kind of going to have to get over it. And it's also not fly print. So while these may look like the Air Zoom Vapors we got the concept of last year, they're very much not. Starting with number 1, because that makes sense, you've got this big pink area running through the middle of the boot, and this is the Avail Q lining. Now, technically, it's not just this pink area. It runs down the entire length of the boot, and then on top of this Avail Q lining, you have the Titan synthetic, which is what is going to give all of these different colors and give all of the different elements. So it's kind of all Avail Q lining. If we are to discuss it purely as a liner, then it is certainly thicker than what you got on the previous generation's boots, but it's also far softer. It's a really nice synthetic suede that runs all the way down the boot, instead of the slightly thinner, more plasticky feeling that you got on the inside of the previous gen. But the reason for that is because it actually makes up more of the structure of the boot. It's more important to the overall composition to have that Avail Q lining than it was here, where the actual flyknit made up the majority of the upper. So the Avail Q lining certainly bumps the comfort levels of the boot here. You might also expect it to kind of take away from some of that barefoot sensation based on that description I just gave you of something that's a far more substantial liner, because generally that's what tends to happen. However, because of the construction of the rest of the boot, that's not quite the case. So moving on. So while 2, 3, and 4 are all technically part of that Avail Q liner, the way that the Titan synthetic is modified between each area means that they respond and react differently, and then that's what you can see in the different colors that run all the way through the boot. Number 2 is the Speed Band, and this is a reinforced Titan synthetic. So there's a nylon that runs above the liner and below the Titan synthetic across the whole boot, simply designed to give you better lockdown and better responsiveness in the boot. Number 3 is this orange toe box area, which Nike have called the Vamp lining. So that's a thinner area of the Titan synthetic that's there to give you a sharper touch on the ball, which is noticeable when you compare it to the midfoot area. Well, it is if you go looking for it. This section also makes the speed band feel more necessary, as the vamp lining section feels less structured and the boot as a whole would suffer if that feeling and sensation continued too far up the boot. Number 4 is very simple. This red piece right at the front of the toe box is the toe reinforcer. Does exactly what it says on the tin. It's for durability and shape. It's thicker and stiffer than the rest of the upper material, so it's thicker, tight and synthetic, but that really doesn't matter, doesn't make a difference. It does what it's there to do. It's for durability and to maintain the shape of the boot. Number 5 is the Speed Collar Package, as Nike have called it, which is a really fancy name for this bit of see-through material here, which means you can see directly through into the color of the heel liner. The heel liner is bright orange and runs from here and back round the back of the boot. So it's basically the heel liner and the heel padding, which Nike have called a Speed Collar Package, because fancy names make things better. I feel like they really wanted 7 pieces of tech here, so they kind of pulled at straws for a couple of little things. And next up we have the Speed Wings. This is a technology that I don't expect to be on every single colorway because it's aesthetic, it does nothing, and I would anticipate that this is something that maybe gets dropped for a few colorways if the designers don't necessarily need it. What are these mythical speed wings? Are they going to make you go faster? No, not at all. Speed wings are these bits here. So this is a little bit of kind of stuck on plastic, and they're at either side. I have no idea what they do, what they're there for. They don't do anything as far as I can tell, and they just sit around the edge of the heel counter. It's visual. But those are the speed wings. You've now got speed wings, everybody. Look how fast I can run. 7 is probably the thing we are most familiar with. Flyknit. So this isn't an entirely synthetic boot. It takes very much the same form as the previous generation, where you can even see that the dual lace hole setup through the middle of the one-piece upper is actually identical between both boots, and it has pretty much the same stretchy flyknit through that upper as well. This flyknit, the actual stitch itself, has been changed slightly between the two models, but it feels very, very similar. And the difference between the Superfly that I have here and the Vapor is literally going to be that flyknit is going to come to a low cut in the Vapor and it goes up into this dynamic fit collar in the Superfly. There's very, very little difference between the two, but it's a nice stretchy flyknit. It wraps around your collar, around your ankle really nicely, and it provides a good fit on the boot. Something that you do want to note though is that this is now back up to like Superfly 5 height. So they lowered the collar height for the Superfly 7, which is something that I quite liked. It was very reminiscent of how Ronaldo has his boots customed by Nike. These ones are back up to kind of like a Superfly 5 look, which is something that I didn't really like when I saw the initial pictures. However, once I got them on feet, I could be convinced, I could be swayed that this is actually a good looking element. I'm not against it anyway. Superfly or Vapor, it's up to you. The Superfly, as normal, is more expensive, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. From a tech perspective, the only thing I haven't covered on the upper is this crisscross pattern that runs all the way around the boot, which does look fairly similar to that pattern that you've got on the previous generation with the 2 different types of yarn that are blended together. Now it's not that, but it is yarn, and it's a yarn that's been melted onto the top of the upper. It's there for 2 reasons. One is that it's going to provide extra support, structure, and basically make the boot a bit more stable, a bit more responsive. You can tell that because if you look at the concentration of the pattern, it's far more concentrated through this speed band midfoot area, basically to give you that extra responsiveness and support you need, and then the rest of it kind of opens out into a wider pattern. The other thing that it does is it does provide a little bit of much needed texture to the top of the boot. So there is actually a kind of tactile element to the boot. Now, in my opinion, on the ball and in hand, it's not as effective or as extreme as what you got on the Vapor 13. Neither one is particularly extreme, and this definitely feels a little more matte than the Vapor, but overall the actual texture itself just doesn't seem to be quite as much as what you got from the previous model. So a combination of this yarn that's been melted on top and also that speed band really does sound like a great idea for making a properly responsive football boot. However, this is the one area of the upper where I do kind of have a complaint. There is no way, and in no test that I've done, that this particular boot is as responsive as what it replaces. It's still responsive, it's plenty responsive, but this was a super locked in, super responsive boot, and you just don't get that same level here. I feel my foot move in this far more than I ever did in a Vapor 13 or a Superfly 7. Lockdown is still good, but it doesn't translate to the level of responsiveness that I've come to expect from the current Mercurial range. Now that also means there's some kind of positive trade-offs where you get other advantages from the way that this boot is built, which we'll get into, but if responsiveness is right at the top of your list, it's good, it's just not Vapor 13 good. So one of the things that did concern me about this boot when I first saw the images, I first saw there's going to be synthetic, was that I thought it was going to be much, much stiffer than it actually is. I expected this to kind of be stiff along the lines of the X Ghosted. Thankfully, that's actually not the case. For a synthetic boot, this is still pretty pliable and pretty soft. However, again, when you compare that to the previous generation, it's not as soft as this. This certainly has a softer upper, particularly out of the box, and it softens in even more, whereas this is soft enough and it softens in somewhat, but it's not as soft as what you got with the previous model. A big plus though is that it's definitely soft enough that you don't get these kind of big creases and bunches round the boot when you bend your foot. That's a massive positive. That is a problem that you had with, or I do have, with the X Ghosted line, where the synthetic is just that bit too stiff and it does bend and crease. That's not the case here, and I would even say that when putting these on, kind of bending to run and sprint, these actually formed to my feet with less bends and creases than I got on the previous generation, despite them not feeling kind of super soft. It's pretty good, and like I say, don't take it that they're not a soft boot. They are surprisingly soft and surprisingly good. The previous gen is just that little bit softer. So the important thing through all of that is, how do all those elements add up to give you a touch on the ball? What is the touch on the ball like? Well, if you take the fact that this is a synthetic Mercurial, you might expect or want it to be like an old Tajin synthetic Mercurial. But in actual fact, it's far more similar to what it replaces. The touch on the ball between these two boots is remarkably similar in actual fact. The only difference you could say is that maybe sometimes the Vapor 13 is a little more solid in the way it contacts, but it is certainly close, very barefoot, very pingy. And then sometimes this can feel a little bit more raw because of the way the ball comes off the synthetic outer material. It just feels maybe a little more raw and a little more pingy. It could be described as being more authentically barefoot and speed boot, but this also wraps to your foot slightly more. Again, we'll get into that soon. The long and short of it is really similar from an upper perspective in terms of performance and touch, and that is absolutely no bad thing, because I've repeatedly said that I think this is one of the best, if not the best, performing boot on the market, and if this is hitting those heights, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that in my book. Would it have been great to see Nike take the upper on this and go to like a whole new level? Well, yes, but honestly, improving on this is no small feat. So I think what they've done is given us a synthetic upper, done it in a really positive manner, and given us something that still performs pretty much as well as the previous generation, although I will complain about the responsiveness as a comparison. Another area where things have changed but still remain remarkably similar is the traction. Nike are still using the Aerotrax outsole technology, where the boot has progressive stiffness through the forefoot, and they've modified it slightly where the Aerotrax section actually runs all the way to the tip of the boot. So this green spine actually runs the entire length of the boot instead of just being this white section that's in here. It does feel like this has made the boot marginally snappier and more responsive. Not a huge amount, but I can definitely tell that there is some kind of a difference, particularly when I'm stood here doing it in my hand. On your feet, you're not likely to see a huge difference. But then that spine runs down the middle of the boot. So this is also Aerotrax, and now you have this connected torsion bar instead of just a regular split sole. And what this does is it just gives you a little bit more stability and structure through the midfoot of the boot, and that does mean that the boot is slightly stiffer and slightly more rigid through that back 2/3, which is absolutely no bad thing. There's a little bit more flex in the previous generation, although again, the difference is minimal, negligible, and you're not really going to spot much when it's on your feet. The actual stud pattern remains almost identical, with everything being in pretty much exactly the same place. However, the studs themselves have had the orientation change slightly, and in some cases the length and the shape as well. In my opinion, this isn't a bad thing, and this is where the kind of dragonfly inspiration really starts to come through for me. If you didn't know, Nike's spirit animal, or animal inspiration more accurately, for this boot was the dragonfly, which is kind of an odd choice when you consider some of like the big cats that they've used before, things that are just incredibly fast, and now they've gone for a dragonfly. Well, I think that the Soleplate can actually show why they've gone for the dragonfly. So the dragonfly can move in many different directions, has fantastic range of motion, and can go as fast forwards as it can backwards. And I think that shows through in the new Soleplate layout. So what you've got is where all of these studs have been angled slightly further outwards. So it's actually a little more reminiscent of what you got from the Phantom Venom line as opposed to the current Mercurial line, even though it's definitely closer to the current Mercurial. Some studs have just been widened out and just lengthened slightly. Some have been shortened down, and just those slight rotations outwards make this a little bit better for those quick cuts and changes of direction. It's a little bit more agile than it used to be. So yes, it's not about crazy aggressive straight line speed anymore, but the boot is still pretty much the most aggressive on the market when it comes to stud shape and stud pattern, so there's still nothing to complain about, and it is just that little bit more forgiving, which isn't a bad thing. It just gives you more options to move in more directions with good traction, and I actually prefer these slight tweaks over what we had on the previous generation, which is great. It's fantastic because of the aggressive straight line speed, but these little tweaks, they don't take away from it, they just add to the overall feeling and movement you get in the boot. For me, the new outsole is improved over the previous generation in almost every way by just making minor tweaks here and there. So what it does is it retains all of that mercurial DNA that you're looking for while making it a little bit more forgiving, and also including or maintaining some of those previous elements that we really love, such as the anatomical sole plate. It's good work. It's really good work. Okay, wait, not a super important category overall, provided the boots aren't stupid heavy. However, these are speed boots, so they are supposed to be light. Let's see what these brand new Superfly 8s come in at. Popping them on the scales, and this is in a UK 7. So this is a US 8, and these come in at 192 grams. So what we're gonna do now is pop them off, and we're going to put on the previous generation just here. and that one comes in at 186 grams. So there is a small difference. There's 6 grams between these two boots, and it's barely noticeable in hand. However, I would actually argue that despite these being lighter, because of the way these are built and the fact that the upper does feel a bit thinner, they actually feel lighter on feet when compared to that old generation. Now, this does mean that the Mercurial and Nike haven't taken a big step forward towards trying to make the lightest possible football boot and joining in what seems to be a race between Puma and Adidas at the moment, where they're both pushing the boundaries of lightweight boots. I'm absolutely not against that. There's nothing wrong with just making a really good football boot that's also lightweight, because it's a speed boot and that's what it's supposed to be. It doesn't have to be the lightest boot around. However, if all you care about is weight, then go and buy a Puma Ultra. This isn't the boot for you, but it's still very, very light. Okay, fit and comfort. And the first thing that really surprised me about this, before anything else, before I even started getting into how they felt on with the touch on the ball or the traction, was the comfort. I think that these are a more comfortable boot than what they replaced. These are more comfortable than the previous generation Vapor and Superfly. I think some of that comes down to the fact that it has that really nice synthetic suede liner all the way through the boot. That feels beautiful and premium against your feet. I really enjoy that a lot. But I also think some of it comes down to the fact that there feels like there's a little bit more room in the boot, especially through this toe box area. There are positives and negatives to this. Plus side, more comfort. Downside, I don't feel like the boot wraps quite as tightly to my foot as the Vapor 13 Elite did. It's still close, it's still tight fitting, and still gives you a very close to the ball feeling, but the Vapor 13 is just that little bit closer and that little bit tighter, which does lead to a more traditional Vapor-like feeling, and of course it does help with your closeness to the ball, although there's no difference between them, and it also helps with the responsiveness of the boot overall. The question is, would you be willing to sacrifice the extra comfort you're going to get from the new generation to get that slightly tighter fit on the old generation? Now, I might say yes, but I would say that majority of people would say no, because the difference is fairly minimal and the added comfort is actually even more noticeable. So most people would probably prefer the feel of these on feet from a comfort perspective, no doubt. The heel is another area where there's been small tweaks made in terms of the internal padding. Now, it seems like there's the same amount of padding, but the way the padding's been placed, constructed, and the way it holds its shape is better in the new generation, which means, again, it just feels more padded and comfortable through the heel. But there's also a trade-off with that. You can see a theme here. There's a lot of things that have happened to this brand new Vapor or Superfly model to improve it in some areas, but you've got a trade-off in other areas when compared to the previous generation. The trade-off here is that I don't think the heel grabs into my heel quite so much on the newer generation. So I don't feel quite as locked in, even though, again, the difference is fairly minimal. But when I first got these, I definitely felt a little bit of heel movement better now, whereas I never had that with these. So again, it's a trade-off. It's comfort for a tiny bit of lockdown. Sizing width-wise, there's very little difference between them, although you could argue that the newer generation is slightly more forgiving, especially through the toe box. Still not a boot that I would recommend for wide feet. It's still tight, it still wraps to your foot, and if you do have a very wide foot, it's not a boot I'd say to go and try. Length is almost identical. There's no difference that is even marginally noticeable between the two, which means that my true to size assessment is still correct from the previous generation. Go true to size, no ifs, no buts, no anything else. just go true to size. Overall, this is kind of much of the same, which isn't a bad thing, and it's also really impressive considering that this is a complete redesign and even the upper materials are different. And to be able to do that and deliver a boot that still delivers almost the same performance, better in some areas, worse in others, than the previous generation, which is just such a phenomenal boot, is mighty impressive from Nike. So yes, there's a slightly less aggressive fit, traction, lockdown and responsiveness, but only slightly. But what you gain is a boot that's more accommodating, forgiving and comfortable. So there's been a little bit of give and take, but it's still a phenomenal football boot. Like really, really good. Are Nike still the top of the speed boot tree? For my money, probably. Do remember to support the channel if you can by heading over to patreon.com/bootwizard if you want to buy a pair of these. Link down in my top comment. Remember to like this video because it means I can make more videos, help YouTube push my videos, algorithms, etc, etc. And do get subscribed to the channel because I have more amazing stuff coming. My Predator Freak review's already on there. We're going to do a boot battle between this and this. We're going to really see who comes out on top. What more could you possibly want? That's all from me here today. Have a good one, and we'll see you soon.